welcome. Tonight you're stepping into a case where Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin peel back layers of marble, legacy, and long-buried secrets. A man has died in his mansion, but was it a fall, or a quiet execution wrapped in wealth and silence? As Wolfe sits immovable in his chair and Archie tracks whispers through cracked stone, the truth waits beneath. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you now? Settle in, because some murders aren't about passion or revenge. They're about the things people would rather keep hidden forever. It was 4:15 on a Thursday, and the world outside the brownstone was engaging in its usual racket, none of which concerned us. I was at my desk, half-heartedly filing notes from the previous week's minor misadventure involving a purloined will and a very excitable parrot, while Wolfe was upstairs committing his daily act of infidelity with his orchids. All was routine, serene, and pleasantly dull, until the front bell rang with a sharpness that suggested desperation or salesmanship. I glanced at the clock, scowled, and rose with the reluctant grace of a man who knows better but answers anyway. Wolfe would have preferred I ignore it, but experience had taught me that things refusing to wait at the front door often carried bigger trouble if left unattended. Crossing the hall, I opened the door, expecting a delivery boy or another misguided solicitor. What I got instead was a woman, pale, breathless, and clutching her bag like a lifeline, her eyes wide with some private terror that didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me before I could voice a greeting or a protest, leaving a faint trail of perfume and panic in her wake. I closed the door more out of habit than design, watching her clutch the edge of the hall table for support. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I have to see Mr. Wolfe. Please, it's urgent." I studied her with a practiced eye. Early 30s, dressed well enough that the wrinkles in her suit were from stress, not poverty. Her hands shook, but not from cold. This wasn't garden-variety agitation. This was the real, uncut brand. "You and everybody else, sister," I said, not unkindly. "Unfortunately, Mr. Wolfe doesn't see visitors without notice unless there's blood or money involved. You bringing either?" "Blood," she whispered, the word almost catching in her throat. "There's been a death. It wasn't an accident. I need Mr. Wolfe to prove it." And just like that, my day took a sharp left turn into business. I led her into the office with the efficiency of a man who knew Wolfe would disapprove, but also that Wolfe valued curiosity more than dignity when properly baited. She perched on the edge of the red leather chair, looking too brittle for furniture. "Name?" I asked, reaching for the notebook. "Veronica Vale," she said. Curtis Vale was my brother-in-law. That gave me a second's pause. Curtis Vale was a name with weight, old money, older property, and a reputation as solid as his marble-floored mansion Vale Crest. I raised an eyebrow. "And Curtis Vale is dead," she said. "This morning. They say he slipped on the marble staircase and fell. Broken neck. Instant, they said." "They being?" "The police, the doctor, everyone." "And you don't agree?" I guessed. "No." Her hands twisted the strap of her handbag until it looked ready to snap. "Curtis didn't fall, he was pushed, or worse. Something happened. Something no one wants to admit." Her voice cracked, and for a second the room was thick with her fear. I didn't buy panic easy, but there was something raw in her certainty that made me reconsider the slow afternoon I thought I was having. I had heard plenty of sob stories at that desk, but Veronica Vale's had a curious absence of self-pity. She wasn't there to mourn, she was there to fight. "I need Mr. Wolfe," she said again, softer this time, as if invoking a last hope. "Before they bury Curtis and everything else." "You'll need more than vague suspicions," I said, as gently as a man can say when he's about to poke holes in a stranger's grief. "Any idea who might have wanted him dead?" For a moment she hesitated, a shadow flickering across her expression. "Everyone," she said finally. "His wife, his brother, his secretary, even his doctor. Curtis had secrets, things he was planning to reveal, things buried under Vale Crest." I frowned. Secrets like what? She shook her head, visibly restraining herself. I can't say yet. Not until Mr. Wolfe agrees to help. I opened my mouth to press harder, but the sound of the elevator descending interrupted me. Wolfe was coming down from his orchids, a rare occurrence before dinner. Maybe, just maybe, this strange woman's timing was better than it looked. Wolfe entered with the slow majesty of a man who never hurried for less than a national emergency. He took one look at Veronica Vale, another at me, and grunted, a sound that could mean displeasure, curiosity, or mild constipation. "Archie," he said, settling heavily into his chair, "explain." I did, crisply, while Veronica clutched her bag like it might defend her from gravity. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Miss Vale," he said, "you intrigue me despite my better judgment. Mr. Goodwin will investigate. If your fears prove substantive, I shall consider formal engagement." Veronica rose, tremulously grateful, and made her way to the door. She paused, looked back once, and said in a low, shaking voice, "There's more than blood under those floors, Mr. Wolfe. There's a whole buried life." Then she was gone, leaving the faint smell of gardenias and trouble behind her. Vale Crest didn't exactly roll out a welcome mat. It loomed instead, a block of cold stone and sharper memories, sitting heavy under a sky that couldn't make up its mind between rain and gloom. Even in its better days, I doubted the mansion had ever smiled at a visitor. Now, with Curtis Vale lying dead inside, it wore mourning like an old habit. I eased the sedan into the curved drive, taking a moment to study the layout. Grand front steps, marble entryway, broad windows that somehow managed to look blind. Money had built it, no question, but time, or maybe conscience, had been eating at the foundation. I rang the brass knocker and waited. No butler, no footman, just the echo of my knock crawling through the hollow insides. After a minute, the door opened inward with a slow, reluctant groan, and I stepped inside to the smell of polished floors and something less wholesome underneath. Curtis Vale's body was already gone, carted off to the appropriate authorities, but the house still felt occupied by him, or at least by the questions he'd left behind. I adjusted my hat, squared my shoulders, and went looking for answers. Margaret Vale met me in the formal sitting room, a cavernous space with just enough fire burning to keep the cold from winning. She rose when I entered, but only by degrees, as if motion itself offended her. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked, her voice polished smooth by generations of breeding and just a touch of disdain. I confirmed the name and took a seat opposite her, notebook ready but not yet open. "You're here on behalf of Mr. Wolfe," she stated, not asked. "Unofficially," I said. "We're just curious about your husband's death." She offered a smile so slight it might have been a tick. I imagine many people are. Curtis was not universally beloved. "And yet," I said, glancing around, "not much mourning going on." Margaret folded her hands with mechanical precision. "Curtis and I lived parallel lives, Mr. Goodwin. His death has crossed mine no more violently than a passing train. Grief, where warranted, has a way of announcing itself. You'll find none here." It was hard to tell whether she was being honest or merely efficient, but either way it left me with a prickle of suspicion. A widow who felt nothing for a dead man usually had reasons, and reasons could be murder. I found Andrew Vale brooding by a side window, glass in hand, Scotch dark and mean-looking. He turned as I approached, sizing me up with a sneer that didn't take the trouble to be polite. "You're Wolfe's boy?" he said. "Come to poke the corpse?" "Strictly sightseeing," I said, flashing a grin. "You Andrew Vale?" He gave a mocking bow. "The prodigal brother, though I don't recall being missed." We sat, or rather, he flung himself back into a worn leather chair, and I began the dance of questions. Andrew didn't hesitate. He hated Curtis and said so with the bitterness of a man who'd nursed the grudge to maturity. Curtis had, according to Andrew, sabotaged his career, pulled funding, whispered poison into the right ears, made sure Andrew's architectural ambitions crumbled into dust. I wanted him broken, Andrew said, eyes gleaming. Not dead, but sometimes the world does you a favor you don't ask for. I scribbled in my notebook but made sure not to look too interested. The thing about men like Andrew was they told you too much when you acted like you weren't listening. And what he wasn't saying was louder than all the rest. The next on my informal roster was Marion Croft, Curtis's secretary. She had the startled, jittery look of a rabbit who had just discovered a fox convention being held in her backyard. Her hands fluttered at the hem of her skirt, and she spoke in soft, half-swallowed sentences. I don't know much, she insisted. Curtis, he was private, very private. Private enough to fall down his own stairs? I asked, gently. Marion's face paled, and she shook her head without speaking. She knew something, probably a lot of somethings, but fear had stitched her mouth shut for now. Before I could press further, Dr. Stephen Milford materialized from the adjoining room like a magician on cue. He was polished, pressed, and a little too eager to explain. Natural causes, he said briskly. A tragic fall. These marble floors are treacherous when wet, you know. I hadn't mentioned anything about wet floors, but Milford was already charging ahead, waving off questions with the air of a man expecting gratitude for his thoroughness. Too smooth, too rehearsed. I tucked that away alongside Marion's terror and moved on, knowing the real story was waiting to be dragged into the light. I found Inspector Kramer in the front hall, barking orders at a couple of uniforms and looking like a man who hadn't slept well. His face soured further when he spotted me. "Goodwin," he growled, like he'd stepped in something unpleasant. "Tell Wolfe to keep his fat nose out of this one. It's an accident. Clear cut." "If it's so clear," I said, smiling sweetly, "you won't mind if we take a polite peek around?" He muttered something inventive under his breath, but turned back to his men. I took that as reluctant permission. When Kramer didn't physically throw you out, it counted as a blessing. On my second pass around the scene, curiosity pulled me toward a planter at the base of the grand staircase. Something glinted behind it, faint but insistent. I bent down, pretending to tighten a shoelace, and palmed the object before anyone noticed. A chisel, blood-streaked, hidden poorly enough that it might have been rushed. An accident, Kramer had said. An accident didn't involve a concealed bloody tool. Pocketing the chisel carefully, I straightened and gave the staircase one last glance. Curtis Vale hadn't fallen. Curtis Vale had been pushed, hard enough that marble cracked and blood spilled. And now it was up to Wolfe, and me, to prove it. I gave Wolfe the lowdown while he sat in the big chair, leaning back like a Roman emperor waiting for the next course. I didn't skimp on the details. Kramer's quick dismissal, Margaret's frigid detachment, Andrew's blazing resentment, and the oddities surrounding the marble floor and the bloodied chisel. Wolfe, naturally, didn't so much as twitch an eyebrow. His hands were steepled against his considerable middle, and the only sign he was alive was the slight tapping of his index fingers. "Pfui," he said when I finished. "A man does not shatter marble with his skull absent extraordinary force. This," he flicked a hand as if dismissing the entire New York police force, "is not an accident. It is an orchestration." I grinned. "Thought you'd like that?" He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with the slow precision of a cat considering its prey. "Miss Vale must be summoned. Her utility is no longer speculative. It is required." I picked up the phone, dialed her number, and set the trap in motion. Whatever was buried under Vale Crest's marble floors, it wasn't going to stay buried for much longer. Veronica arrived a scant hour later, paler and more tightly wound than before. Wolfe didn't bother with pleasantries. He waved her into the red chair like a judge admitting a reluctant witness and launched straight into it. "You indicated Curtis Vale possessed secrets," he said. "Clarify." Her hands twisted in her lap. "He was planning to make everything public," she said. "All the things he kept hidden, the money, the vault." Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "Vault?" "A one room beneath the marble floor," she whispered. Curtis had it built years ago. No one outside the family knew. "And the contents of this vault?" Wolfe pressed. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head frantically. "I only know he was afraid. He said if the truth came out, it would ruin the family." Wolfe leaned back, satisfied for the moment, though his tone remained cold enough to frost windows. "Fear," he mused, "is rarely unaccompanied by enemies. Enumerate those who had reason to abhor your brother-in-law." She blinked at him, then began to speak, a slow, reluctant roll call of names. Margaret, Andrew, Marion, even Dr. Milford. As each was uttered, Wolfe's smile grew colder, sharper, and more inevitable. Wolfe dispatched me for additional colour. It didn't take long. A casual conversation with Dr. Milford, couched in the language of idle curiosity, yielded more than a medical report. "Sad case," Milford said, sipping his coffee. Curtis was about to cut Veronica off entirely. She was practically living off his charity. "That's so," I said, injecting just the right amount of skepticism. Milford leaned in, eager. Curtis was amending his will, planning to leave almost everything to charity. Veronica would have been left with nothing. He smiled thinly. Desperation does strange things to people. I filed that under convenient, but not convincing. If Veronica knew her lifeline was being cut, she had motive enough to act, but it was too clean, too neat. Real life, especially around Curtis Vale's crowd, never wrapped itself up with a bow. When I reported back to Wolfe, he listened in silence, nodding once when I finished. "It is a possibility," he admitted, "but possibilities are plentiful, certainties are precious." He lifted a heavy eyelid. "We must press Miss Vale further. Pressure reveals fractures and truths. And if Veronica cracked under the right kind of pressure, we might yet glimpse what Curtis Vale had died trying to protect." Back in the office, Wolfe turned the screws. His questions were precise, relentless, stripping away Veronica's defenses like paint under acid. "You were financially dependent upon him," Wolfe stated. "You knew you would lose everything." Veronica flinched. "I didn't kill him." "Perhaps not by your hand," Wolfe said, voice as smooth as silk over steel. "But by your will? By incitement?" "No!" she cried, voice breaking. "I loved Curtis, despite everything, his cruelty, his secrets. I stayed. I fought to stay." Wolfe observed her with the detachment of a biologist examining a specimen. I, on the other hand, saw the way her hands trembled, the way her eyes pleaded not just for belief, but for absolution. "You must understand," she said, desperate now. "I tried to protect him, to protect the family. I begged him not to reveal everything, but he wouldn't listen. He was determined." Tears streaked her cheeks unchecked. Whether they were the tears of guilt or grief, I wasn't ready to say. Wolfe steepled his fingers again. "I understand that desperate people are capable of noble lies and ignoble acts. I will discern which applies to you." With a curt motion, he ended the interview, but not the lingering taste of uncertainty she left behind. When the door finally closed behind Veronica Vale, Wolfe remained silent for a long, weighty moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a small grunt, he turned to me. "Archie," he said, "we require certainty, not sentimentality. You will procure Curtis Vale's testament, its final iteration." "Just walk in and ask nicely?" I said, arching an eyebrow. "Exercise discretion," Wolfe said. "Charm, subterfuge, or bribery, as necessary, but obtain it." It was the quietness of the order that emphasized its urgency. Wolfe rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. He simply expected the universe to comply. I grabbed my coat and hat, already calculating angles. Margaret Vale might have access, or Marion Croft. Either way, the path to the truth lay in ink and signature, not tears and protestations. As I headed for the door, Wolfe called after me, his voice heavy with certainty. "Miss Vale's tears are irrelevant. What Curtis Vale intended to do with his fortune, and to whom he intended to deny it, will illuminate the motive." I nodded, and stepped out into the gathering darkness. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. At Vale Crest, blood wasn't the only thing staining the marble. Finding Pete Garrison wasn't hard. Finding him willing to talk was another story. He was a wiry man with permanent concrete dust under his fingernails and a face set in the permanent expression of a man who'd seen too much and been paid too little for it. I caught him smoking behind the Vale Crest carriage house and started with polite conversation, which got me exactly nowhere. A $20 bill, however, proved more persuasive. Pete shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing around like the rose bushes might sprout ears. "Look, Mr. Goodwin," he muttered. "I ain't supposed to say nothing. Mr. Curtis was real particular." "Particular how?" I prompted, letting the bill brush the edge of his jacket pocket. He swallowed hard. "He had me and my boys work nights, covered the windows, locked every door. He didn't want nobody seeing what we was doing." "And what was that?" Pete hesitated, then said, low and miserable, "He had us reinforce the foundation under the marble staircase, built in a kind of room. Not big. Just enough to stash something important, I guess." He wiped his hands on his trousers, nerves leaking through his skin. "It wasn't for no wine cellar," he added darkly, "and it wasn't for show." Which begged the question, if it wasn't for showing off, what had Curtis Vale been so desperate to hide? "Vault," Pete said at last, spitting the word like it tasted bad. "That's what Mr. Vale called it? My vault, like he was some kind of king guarding his treasure." "Treasure, huh?" I said, keeping my voice casual. Pete shrugged, but his eyes flickered nervously. "I didn't ask what was going in, wasn't paid to ask, but I heard things. Heavy crates, wood splintering. Couple of them smelled musty, like real old books or leather. Anyone else know about it?" "Nobody who'd admit it." He scratched the back of his neck. "He had the whole crew sign some kind of paper. Confidentiality," he said. Made it sound official. Scared the pants off most of them. I didn't doubt it. Wealth and power could wrap up a lot of dirty secrets in silk and signatures. "And now," I said softly, "Curtis is dead." Pete nodded grimly. "Yeah. And if you're asking me, that vault's got something to do with it." I slipped him another folded bill for his trouble and left him standing there, a man who looked like he wished he'd never set foot under Vale Crest's marble floors. I returned to the mansion under the pretense of representing Curtis Vale's insurance policy. The widow Margaret had been too disinterested to care, and Andrew was too hungover to protest. In the grand hall, I slowed my steps and let my gaze drift over the marble staircase with the casual air of a man who had all the time in the world. Hairline cracks spiderwebbed out from the base of the newel post, too fine to catch a civilian's eye, but sharp enough for someone who knew what to look for. There was a faint, uneven settling where the marble met the floor, a whisper of disturbance under all that grandeur. I knelt down, pretending to adjust my laces, and pressed the toe of my shoe against one of the seams. It shifted, minutely, but it shifted. The foundation wasn't as solid as it should have been. Whatever Curtis had hidden under the floor had compromised the structure. And whatever had been resting in that hidden room, it hadn't been resting quietly. I straightened and dusted off my hands. Kramer might have called it an accident, but accidents didn't involve secret vaults built under the feet of a dead man. Wolfe absorbed my report with the solemnity of a priest hearing confession. He tapped the tips of his fingers together and grunted once, deep in his throat. "You observed evidence of movement?" he asked. "Heavy movement," I said. "Recent, too. Something big was shifted out or maybe hidden deeper." Wolfe's lips thinned. "Prior to or subsequent to Curtis Vale's demise?" I shook my head. "Hard to say. But judging by the freshness of the cracks and dust patterns I'd bet on after—" His brows climbed a fraction, suggesting the accident was employed as camouflage. "Exactly." He closed his eyes briefly, calculating. Therefore, the death of Curtis Vale was expedient to someone not merely for inheritance, but for concealment. "And whatever was hidden," I said, It mattered enough to kill for. Wolfe opened his eyes. They glittered like polished onyx. Continue your investigations, Archie. The substance of the matter lies not in sentiment but in weight. I saluted lazily and headed out again, the words echoing in my ears. Weight. Secrets heavy enough to crack marble, and morals brittle enough to kill for them. Whatever Curtis had hoarded beneath Vale Crest had become the motive, and the murder weapon by proxy. By the time the sun dipped behind Vale Crest's jagged rooftop, a suspicion had settled into my gut like a bad meal. Curtis Vale's death hadn't been an act of rage. It hadn't been spontaneous. It had been a calculated erasure, not just of a man, but of whatever evidence he'd been keeping locked beneath his marble kingdom. Someone had needed that vault emptied, or at least silenced, before Curtis could unseal its secrets. And someone else, someone still breathing, was banking on the police, swallowing the accident theory without digging deeper. As I drove back toward the brownstone, the city lights flickering on one by one, I knew Wolfe would already be 3 moves ahead of me. Because murder, in Wolfe's world, was never simply about passion or anger. It was about motive, method, and means. And somewhere, beneath all that polished marble, all 3 were waiting to be uncovered. Wolfe had Margaret Vale seated opposite him again, this time with less courtesy and more calculation. She wore mourning black like it had come off the rack, her posture correct, but guarded. Wolfe's tone, when he began, was not unkind, but it had no softness in it. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "you professed a lack of emotion regarding your husband's death. Detachment is not itself a crime, but it often signals what the law cannot." "I won't defend how I grieve, Mr. Wolfe," she said flatly. "Nor need you. However, grief is not my concern. It is motive." Her eyes flashed. "Are you accusing me?" "No," Wolfe said mildly. "I'm simply confirming that you were engaged in an extramarital affair with Dr. Stephen Milford, a fact which you have yet to volunteer." The room held its breath. Margaret's fingers twitched against the armrest. "That's not relevant," she said finally. "It is profoundly relevant," Wolfe said, his voice rising ever so slightly. "Your husband was preparing to alter his will. Such intentions, when paired with betrayal, often yield lethal consequences." Margaret's jaw clenched, but she didn't deny it. She didn't even blink. The silence that followed was confirmation enough. It didn't take Wolfe long to tug at the next thread. He motioned for me to read back Margaret's prior account of her movements on the morning of Curtis's death, which I did with theatrical precision. She had claimed she was upstairs in the East Wing, reading. "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Then you did not see the doctor arrive at 10:20? "No," she said quickly. "Too quickly. And yet," Wolfe continued, "Dr. Milford stated he found you downstairs near the conservatory, looking for a misplaced brooch." Margaret hesitated. He must be mistaken. I may have stepped down briefly." "Briefly enough to alter the marble beneath your feet?" Wolfe asked, his voice now slicing. Her lips parted in protest, but nothing came out. "The inconsistencies in your narrative are not minor, madam. They are monumental." "I wasn't involved in Curtis's death," she snapped. "Then perhaps," Wolfe said calmly, "you will be good enough to explain why your account of that morning has now changed twice under questioning." The flush in her cheeks had nothing to do with sorrow. And while I wouldn't convict her on inconsistencies alone, it was clear Wolfe had ruffled more than her composure. Back at Vale Crest, I decided to do a little freelance sleuthing while Wolfe meditated on Margaret's moral flexibility. A quiet word with the housekeeper, plus a generous tip, steered me toward a locked drawer in the late Curtis Vale's private study, specifically one reserved for legal matters. With a little gentle persuasion, also known as a flat-edged letter opener, I managed to spring the drawer. Inside, tucked between insurance policies and property deeds, was a signed and notarized divorce settlement, dated 2 weeks prior, initiated by Margaret Vale. I whistled low and folded the document neatly back into place. Margaret hadn't been plotting murder, she'd been plotting escape, the kind of escape that left reputations intact and bank accounts fortified, and Curtis, to his credit or cruelty, had agreed. It didn't prove she hadn't killed him, of course. Divorce settlements didn't eliminate motive, they just shifted it. But it did make things less black and white. If Margaret was already walking out the front door legally, why risk everything by slipping a man down the marble steps? When I brought the news back to Wolfe, he nodded once. "Desperation breeds violence," he said. "But so does fear of exposure. We must ask what she feared more, Curtis or what he knew." Back in the office, Wolfe's tone softened, but only slightly. He was a man who distrusted sentiment unless it served logic. Margaret's case had given him a rare pause. "Archie," he said, "the affair with Dr. Milford and the divorce settlement are facts, but facts do not equate to guilt. What do you perceive?" "I think she wanted out," I said, "but not in a pine box. She had what she needed, papers signed, settlement locked. Killing him would have endangered everything." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured, "and yet her emotional neutrality is, disconcerting. She's not the weeping kind, Number, but we must consider that her motive was not destruction but self-preservation. Her lies, then, may not conceal murder, but shame." I nodded. "Shame over the affair, over leaving him." "Precisely. And if Curtis discovered that his wife intended to betray him legally and romantically, his reaction may have prompted a fatal escalation by someone else." The recentering of the case away from Margaret didn't absolve her, but it opened up new corridors of suspicion. And in Wolfe's house, a shift in suspicion was almost as good as a confession. Almost. I circled back to Vale Crest one last time, officially under the guise of retrieving a misplaced brief from my insurance inspection. In truth, I wanted a final look at Margaret, and anything else she might be hiding. I caught her in the garden, burning a bundle of letters over a cast-iron brazier. It was dramatic and very nearly poetic. "Spring cleaning?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She looked up, startled, then quickly defensive. "Old things. They mean nothing. Funny how things that mean nothing tend to get burned." She didn't reply. I let her think I was dropping it, but as she turned away, one envelope fluttered loose and landed near my shoe. I scooped it up before she could protest. Most of the text was already singed, except for 2 words on the letter's final line. "Marble key." I slipped it into my coat while she wasn't looking. Back at the brownstone, I handed it to Wolfe without a word. He examined it, then said softly, "A key not to a door, but a truth buried beneath stone. Excellent work, Archie." I tipped an imaginary hat. Something was hidden in Vale Crest that someone didn't want found, and someone was running out of time to keep it hidden. I found Andrew Vale back in the solarium, alone this time, nursing a fresh drink and a bruise on his ego. The room had too much sun for his temperament, but he didn't seem to mind the heat. "You again," he muttered as I approached. "Don't you ever give up?" "Only on crossword puzzles and diets," I said. "This isn't either." He snorted and took a long swallow. "You're digging for dirt on Curtis," he said. "Plenty of that to go around." I settled opposite him and opened my notebook. "Let's start with what he did to you." Andrew leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "He sabotaged my firm, whispered in the ears of clients, withdrew funding behind my back, then smiled at me across the family table like nothing had happened." "Why?" "Because I embarrassed him. I was loud, I drank too much, I never worshipped him the way the others did." I let the silence do some work before speaking again. "You ever wish he were dead?" "Wish?" Andrew laughed bitterly. "I fantasized about it." He said it like a man ordering his 5th drink. Honest, unfiltered, but hollow. That kind of bitterness didn't kill by itself, but it sure set the stage. "Look," Andrew said, setting down his glass with a clink, "I'm not going to pretend I loved my brother. I didn't. Hell, I barely tolerated him. But I'm no killer." "That's convenient," I said. So's being drunk and bitter with no alibi." He smiled without humor. "My alibi is the truth. I was furious at Curtis, but I didn't lay a finger on him. He wasn't worth the mess." "You said you fantasized about it." "I also fantasized about burning down this mausoleum. Doesn't mean I lit the match." I made a note, slowly. "Anyone else who might have wanted him gone more than you?" Andrew hesitated, then shrugged. "Ask Marion. She was terrified of Curtis, or Margaret. She was always one storm away from bolting." It wasn't a deflection, it was more of a weary listing of family dysfunction. "Curtis had a way of eroding everyone close to him," Andrew said quietly. "Even if you survived him, you weren't whole." That gave me a beat of silence. There was sincerity in it, but sincerity wasn't a defense. I left him there, stewing in resentment. The kind that doesn't kill outright, just poisons everything around it until someone else decides to act. Wolfe had heard enough from me. He summoned Andrew to the brownstone the next morning, and I sat in on the session, mostly to enjoy the show. "Mr. Vale," Wolfe began, "it would save time if you simply admitted that you attempted to blackmail your brother." Andrew flinched, but recovered quickly. "That's absurd." "Is it? You threatened to expose a vault beneath Vale Crest to the Internal Revenue Service, did you not?" Andrew looked toward me, then back at Wolfe. "That was a bluff, a drunken bluff. I never followed through." "But you did make the threat." Andrew exhaled through his nose. "Yes, once. Curtis had secrets. I thought maybe he'd finally take me seriously." "And did he?" "He laughed, said I'd never get close enough to prove anything." Wolfe folded his hands. "You attempted to weaponize knowledge. Failing that, your opportunity for physical retaliation arrived." "No," Andrew said quickly. "I'd already lost. There was no leverage, no gain. Why would I kill him after that?" "A poor man murders in rage," Wolfe said. "A proud man does it to recover power. You are both." But Wolfe's tone lacked conviction. It was a theory, sharp but not airtight. And the next piece was still missing. I tracked down Andrew's alibi like a bloodhound on a bender. A bar called the Gilded Lily, 2 miles from Vale Crest, dimly lit and thick with smoke. I asked the bartender about the night in question. "Oh yeah," he said, drying a glass. "He was here, loud, mean, and generous with his money. Showed up around 10, stayed till near 1. He leave at any point?" "Not that I saw. He got into an argument with a jazz pianist halfway through and ended up buying everyone around." 3 patrons and 1 grizzled barmaid confirmed it. Andrew Vale was many things that night, obnoxious, dramatic, and plastered, but not present at the scene of the crime. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe absorbed the news with a slight twitch of the eyebrow. "He's a fool," Wolfe said, "but not a murderer." "Unless he hired one," I offered. Wolfe dismissed it with a wave. "Unlikely. He lacks the subtlety. Andrew Vale prefers to bruise loudly, not kill quietly." So the man who'd shouted his hate to the rafters was off the hook. But sometimes it was the quiet ones, the ones who didn't say it out loud, that bore watching. I decided to follow up with our friendly neighborhood handyman, Pete Garrison, who had spilled the beans about the vault with all the charm of a man dodging a conscience. Only now Pete wasn't answering his phone, or his door, or anyone else's. I dropped by his apartment, empty. His landlady, a squinting woman with strong opinions and stronger perfume, said he hadn't been seen since the morning after I spoke with him. "Packed a bag," she said. "Didn't even finish his coffee. That man never skips breakfast." I notified Wolfe the moment I returned. "He's fled," Wolfe said flatly. "Scared?" "Or silenced," Wolfe replied, eyes narrowing. "Voluntarily or otherwise he has removed himself. That implies knowledge of danger." "Think he knew something more than he told us?" Wolfe closed his eyes. "If he didn't before, he does now." The silence that followed was not idle. The handyman who'd built the vault was now in hiding, or worse. Curtis Vale had buried something under marble. Now someone was working very hard to keep it buried, and Wolfe, as always, was already digging. I began sniffing around the edges of Curtis Vale's construction secrets the way a fox circles a buried hen. A few well-placed calls to a contractors' union, some handshakes laced with folded bills, and a visit to a subcontractor named Del Grosso got me traction. Del was the talkative type if his palms were greased, and I made sure they glistened. "Yeah, I remember the job," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Private gig, all-night work, fancy materials, client didn't want permits pulled." "Why?" Del shrugged. "Said it was for legacy storage, art stuff, fragile and valuable but not for display, real hush-hush." That made my ears prick. "Anything get delivered?" "Crates, wooden, some heavy enough to need 4 guys, unmarked, but came in from the docks, some European shipping line." I didn't have to guess what kind of legacy was being stashed beneath Vale Crest. Curtis hadn't just wanted to preserve something, he'd wanted it buried out of reach. I thanked Del and left, the final pieces beginning to fit. Whatever was in that vault wasn't just valuable, it was dangerous. Dangerous enough to kill for. When I relayed the findings to Wolfe, his reaction was as close to animated as he got without leaving his chair. "Artifacts smuggled in from Europe?" he repeated. "During wartime?" Del Grosso said they looked like museum pieces, I confirmed. "No markings." Curtis had them sealed under marble like a pharaoh entombing treasure. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Not treasure, contraband." He turned toward the shelf near the globe. "Archie, call the Art Theft Division at Interpol. Quietly. Use the confidential number." It took 3 phone calls and 1 favor owed from a prior favor, but by the next afternoon we had confirmation. Several crates matching the shipment's profile had been traced back to post-war chaos, items looted during the occupation of Austria and France. Paintings, scrolls, gold-framed miniatures, a few missing from noble estates, others from public museums. Curtis Vale had been a wartime buyer, a man who'd purchased what others had no right to sell, and now he'd paid with his life to protect what he never truly owned. Wolfe set down the report and said more to himself than me, "Theft masquerading as guardianship, the oldest lie of wealth." And in that lie, someone had found a reason to kill. Curtis Vale's vault, Wolfe said, was not a refuge. It was a reliquary of guilt. I stood by the bookshelf, thumbing through a notepad. He thought he was preserving culture. "Rubbish," Wolfe snapped. "Preservation is transparent. This was concealment." He turned his gaze to the window, not seeing it. Men of Curtis's ilk believe possession excuses provenance. He convinced himself he was protecting these pieces, perhaps from loss, perhaps from repatriation, but it was always theft. I didn't argue. Wolfe's tone didn't invite commentary, it invited reckoning. "And now," he continued, "someone else has removed the artifacts. The question is whether the motive was moral or mercenary. The floor was cracked. Something big was moved." "Yes," Wolfe nodded. "Either to protect Curtis's legacy or to erase it." He turned to me with that sharp look that meant business. "Find out who else knew, and Archie, if someone would kill to keep a painting hidden, they will not hesitate to kill again to keep it missing." I was already moving. Wolfe wasn't wrong. Curtis Vale hadn't just built a vault under his mansion. He'd built it under the illusion that a legacy could be stolen and still belong to you. Back in the office, Wolfe summoned Veronica Vale once more. She came wearing grief like a borrowed coat, ill-fitting but dutiful. Wolfe wasted no time. "Mrs. Vale, what did you believe your brother-in-law stored beneath Vale Crest?" She blinked. "Family records, jewelry, some heirlooms. He said it was ancestral, private." "You never questioned it?" "He was always secretive," she said. "But I thought he was trying to protect our name." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "From history?" He handed her the Interpol report. As she read, her fingers trembled. "No," she whispered. He said it was all ours, that it came from collections abandoned during the war." Wolfe gave a soft grunt. "Abandoned, yes, like corpses are abandoned. Mrs. Vale, he did not protect the family's name. He buried it in shame and marble." She looked up, her voice cracking. "I didn't know, I swear it." "I believe you," Wolfe said quietly. "But understand this. Your belief sustained his deception." Veronica clutched the report as if it might vanish, and for the first time she looked like she truly mourned. Not the man, but the myth she had followed. Later, while Wolfe retreated into his orchids to consider art theft and human nature, I lingered in the office, going over the case in my head. Curtis Vale hadn't just hoarded stolen relics. He'd curated a personal illusion, an empire built on marble and misdirection. His family thought they lived above the dirt. In truth, they were standing on it. Margaret, with her cold indifference. Andrew, drowning in resentment. Veronica, loyal to the idea of Curtis, but blind to the man. And Marion, the quiet one, the one who knew too much, perhaps from too close. Everyone had their reason to look the other way, or to act. Wolfe once told me that guilt was rarely explosive, it was corrosive. It leaked slowly, like water through cracks in stone, eating away at the facade until something collapsed. Curtis's marble wasn't cracked by accident. It had been broken by weight, by history, by a truth too heavy to hold. The only question that remained was which of them had finally struck the floor, and who had done it to bury what could no longer be hidden. There's something theatrical about a Wolfe summoning, part Greek tragedy, part federal indictment. By noon, the Brownstones' office resembled a powder keg with 6 mismatched fuses. Margaret Vale arrived first, crisp and brittle. Andrew came in hungover and hostile. Dr. Milford followed, smelling faintly of cologne and apprehension. Veronica Vale stood apart, quiet and ashen. Marion Croft slipped in last, trying to disappear into the leather upholstery. Wolfe, of course, didn't rise. He never did. His gaze moved from face to face, expression unreadable. "You are here," he said, "because the manner of Curtis Vale's death was not an accident. It was a culmination of fear, of guilt, of desperate concealment." No one spoke. They rarely did when Wolfe was winding up. I shall, with your indulgence, reconstruct the events not as they were recorded, but as they occurred. I stood behind Wolfe, notebook closed, pencil idle. We were past the phase of questions. This was confession by demolition. And as he began the unraveling, I saw in their faces something I hadn't seen at Vale Crest. Tension. Because the marble was gone now and Wolfe was sweeping away the dust. "Mrs. Vale," Wolfe began, eyes fixed on her, "your actions before and after your husband's death were evasive. You lied about your whereabouts. You destroyed correspondence. You engaged in an affair with Dr. Milford, all of which would suggest motive." Margaret's mouth set in a line, but she said nothing. "However," Wolfe continued, "your desire was not to destroy Curtis Vale, but to escape him. You had negotiated a private divorce, a quiet departure. Murder would have endangered your settlement. You are not, I conclude, a fool." Margaret shifted. I thought I saw relief, tempered by resentment. "You concealed your affair not to protect yourself from justice," Wolfe said, "but from embarrassment. This, while ethically unsavory, does not qualify as lethal." Margaret exhaled. "Then why question me at all?" "To determine," Wolfe said coldly, "whether you were a liar for survival or for sport." He turned his head, dismissing her. "You are no longer under suspicion." She stiffened at the phrasing, but didn't argue. The clearing of one name only made the tension around the others thicken. Because Wolfe didn't exonerate people lightly, only strategically. "Mr. Vale," Wolfe said next, "your hatred for your brother was neither subtle nor concealed. You blamed him for your failed career and attempted to extort him over the vault." Andrew blinked. "It was one threat, made drunk. I didn't follow through." "Indeed," Wolfe said, "and your threat, even if executed, would have resulted in scandal, not death. You are brash, impetuous, and unfiltered. But murder requires focus." Andrew shifted in his seat. "So what, you're clearing me too?" "Do not misunderstand," Wolfe said. "You are guilty of pettiness, of cowardice, and of abandonment of familial integrity. But not, I believe, of homicide, Andrews scoffed. Glad to know I'm just a disappointment, not a criminal. I did not say that, Wolfe replied, but your contribution to your brother's demise was peripheral. It was not a blow, it was erosion. Andrews swallowed hard and looked away. And just like that, another suspect dropped. The room grew more silent, more claustrophobic. 2 names down, 3 to go, and we hadn't yet touched the one who had the most to lose, or to hide. Dr. Milford, Wolfe said, turning his gaze, you arrived at Vale Crest minutes after Curtis's death. Convenient, yes, but perhaps too convenient. Milford's jaw tightened. I live 5 minutes away. Margaret called me. You can check the logs. I have, Wolfe said, and your promptness, while remarkable, does not prove complicity, but it does invite inquiry. Milford straightened. I'm a physician, not a killer. Yes, and a lover, not a husband. You benefited from Curtis's removal, yet you provided no aid in extending his life. I wasn't there when he fell, Milford said. He was already dead. Wolfe's voice cooled further. But you declared the death an accident. You ignored inconsistencies. You, a man of science, swallowed coincidence with astonishing ease. I didn't want to cause further distress, Milford said. No, Wolfe replied. You didn't want attention. The doctor's lips thinned. Can you prove otherwise? No, Wolfe admitted. But neither can I place you at the act. Your cowardice, though egregious, does not equal guilt. Milford's shoulders sagged, part relief, part humiliation. Wolfe looked away from him, and now only one suspect remained unexamined, one who had yet to speak, because she was waiting. Miss Croft, Wolfe said, the tone shifting now, you have been patient. Quiet, perhaps too much so. Marian sat rigid, hands folded, eyes unreadable. You were Curtis Vale's secretary. You had access to the vault. You handled the documents. And you witnessed more than anyone else. She said nothing. You were also the only person, Wolfe went on, who never challenged his secrecy because you were benefiting from it. Marian's lips parted slightly, but no words came. You siphoned from the collection, Wolfe said. Quietly, cautiously, perhaps you believed Curtis would never notice. He didn't, she whispered. But he did, Wolfe replied. He confronted you, threatened exposure, and that, Miss Croft, was when you acted. Marian's hands trembled. I didn't. You used his trust to gain proximity. You waited, you struck, and then you staged the fall, and then, Wolfe added, you removed what you had failed to steal before. Her eyes filled, but not with tears. Anger, fear, regret. Take your pick. It was the silence of a woman out of lies, and Wolfe, now leaning back, let the weight of it hang. The trap hadn't snapped. It had closed without sound. Wolfe gave her one final chance. Miss Croft, do you deny it? Marian's voice was barely audible. He was going to ruin me. Yes, Wolfe said, because you had already ruined yourself. I didn't mean to kill him, she said. I only meant to stop him. He grabbed my wrist. He tripped. It was premeditated, Wolfe cut in. You had already hidden the chisel. You staged the scene. You moved the crates. Her face crumpled then, not with guilt, but with fury. He thought he owned history. He treated me like a servant, like I didn't matter. You mattered enough, Wolfe said, to betray his trust, to steal, then murder, to keep it buried. Kramer, standing silent until then, stepped forward. She's confessed. She's justified, Wolfe said, which is often the same thing. Marian was led out without resistance. As the others sat stunned, Wolfe closed his eyes, murmuring, Curtis Vale did not die for his sins. He died protecting them, and in doing so, passed them on. It didn't happen immediately. Marian sat like stone for a full 5 minutes after Wolfe named her. Her face gave nothing, no trembling lip, no stifled gasp, no denial. But her eyes, once calm with calculation, finally cracked. You think I'm evil, she said at last, her voice low and steady, but trembling just beneath the surface. No, Wolfe replied. You are simply human, corrupted not by design, but by persistence. Her composure snapped. Do you know what he kept down there? She hissed, standing now, voice rising. Do you know what I saw him bury under those floors? Paintings stripped from burnt homes, sculptures torn from cathedrals, pages of stolen history. You profited from it, Wolfe said without flinching. I preserved it, she shot back. He let it rot. He called it his legacy. I called it what it was, a fortune waiting to be stolen again. Your distinction, Wolfe said dryly, is self-flattering. Marian's voice broke. He lied to everyone. He smiled at Veronica, swore on family pride, while hiding loot beneath her feet. And when he found out I had taken pieces, just pieces, he threatened to have me arrested, ruined. You murdered him to silence the exposure, Wolfe said. No, she said bitterly. I murdered him to end the hypocrisy. And with that, she crumbled back into her chair, breathing heavy, eyes wet, finally done running from what she'd done. Wolfe sat in silence, observing her unravel. When he finally spoke, the room braced itself. Curtis Vale, he said, was not a man of simple sin. He did not act out of hunger or desperation. He acted out of entitlement, the entitlement of men who believe wealth sanctifies their theft. He gestured toward the others, and you, each of you, enabled him. By silence, by admiration, by apathy. Margaret looked away. Andrew stared into the floor. Veronica didn't move at all. Wolfe's voice dropped, but it carried more weight for its restraint. Greed rarely manifests itself all at once. It seeps. Like water through limestone, it finds the cracks in a man's principles, then it hollows him out. He turned back to Marian. You did not merely kill Curtis Vale, you accelerated his collapse, and in doing so, you ensured that the rot beneath Vale Crest could no longer be ignored. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was final. A judgment rendered in stone. I glanced at Wolfe, who, for all his thunder, looked weary. Because there was no satisfaction in justice born from decay. Only the dull acknowledgement that corruption once started rarely stays buried, especially under marble. Kramer had been leaning against the wall through most of it, arms folded, his scowl deepening with every truth Wolfe peeled back. When Marian finally slumped into silence, he stepped forward. "You're sure?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," Wolfe said, "unless you wish to try your luck with Miss Vale or Mr. Vale again." Kramer grunted. "One killer's enough for a Thursday." He turned to Marian. "You're under arrest. Anything you say can and will be—" She didn't resist. Her expression was numb. As she stood and was led from the office, Kramer paused. "I still don't like you, Wolfe." "That has been adequately demonstrated," Wolfe said. "But damn it," Kramer muttered, "you're usually right." He left without looking back, and that, coming from Kramer, counted as applause. After the door shut behind Kramer and the murderer he now possessed, Veronica Vale remained seated, as if the verdict hadn't quite reached her yet. "She was his secretary," she said softly. "He trusted her?" "He trusted no one," Wolfe replied. "He controlled people. Those who didn't resist became complicit." She looked up at him. "I thought I was saving the family, staying quiet, supporting him, preserving something?" "You preserved silence," Wolfe said, "but silence is not loyalty." Her chin trembled. "So it was all rot, the whole house, built on a lie." "Yes," Wolfe said, "but it took blood to reveal the crack." She stood slowly, eyes vacant. "There's nothing left of it now, is there?" "No," Wolfe said, almost gently. "Not above ground." Veronica walked to the door without another word. Some truths, when unearthed, don't leave ruins. They leave ghosts. It was well after 8 when I finally returned to the brownstone, having seen Kramer off, Marian delivered, and the last echoes of Vale Crest locked behind a police cordon, and a generation of guilt. The city had begun to wind down, not Wolfe, of course. He doesn't wind down, he resets, like a grandfather clock. I found him in the office, feet on the ottoman, a chilled bottle of Remmers in one hand, the other cradling a glass he'd poured to precisely 2 fingers. "Have you eaten?" he asked without turning. Only my patience, he grunted. Then have Fritz prepare something. You've earned starch. I didn't move to the kitchen. Instead, I dropped into the red chair, loosened my tie, and watched the bubbles in his beer rise and vanish. Curtis Vale buried his past, I said finally, and it clawed its way out. Wolfe sipped slowly. You are attempting poetry. Maybe. I do not require it. No, I thought. He didn't. But after a week of marble floors and buried sins, I needed the ordinary, his chair, his beer, his refusal to entertain sentiment. Even that somehow felt like comfort. Wolfe rested his glass on the coaster, leaned back slightly and closed his eyes, not asleep, but somewhere between thought and digestion. Marble, he said without opening them, is deceptive. You don't say. It is revered for strength, permanence, elegance, but it cracks easily when struck with pressure from within. That a metaphor or a warning? He ignored me. Curtis Vale believed himself a steward of legacy, but what he preserved was not history. It was theft, rot, and cowardice lacquered in wealth. That's legacy for a lot of men, I muttered. Precisely, Wolfe said. He was not unique in his corruption, only in his architecture. There was something heavier in his tone than usual. Not regret, Wolfe had little use for it. But contemplation, maybe. A brief flirtation with the idea that even marble palaces built with precision can hide the filth of the people who walk their halls. He wanted to bury it all, I said. The art, the guilt, even himself. And he succeeded, Wolfe replied, finally opening his eyes, until it shifted beneath his feet. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was earned. I poured myself a glass from the sideboard. No Remmers for me, just the last of the bourbon from last month's Christmas gift basket. It burned just enough to cut the weight. You think Vale knew it would come to this? I asked. No, Wolfe said. He imagined his secrets could outlive him. A mistake made by many. Then he really believed Marion wouldn't talk. He believed everyone around him would remain complicit. They usually do. I turned that over for a while. The way Margaret had lied out of habit, how Andrew had blackmailed out of spite, how Veronica had chosen loyalty over truth, and Marion who saw a vault of shame and thought for once she'd take her share. Some of it, I said, was too rotten to fix. Even for you. Wolfe didn't blink. It is not my task to fix. It is my task to see. Still, I said, it sticks with you. Yes. He refilled his glass. It should. There was nothing righteous in what we'd uncovered. No justice tied with a bow, just a murder smothered in old dust, cracked open by greed and pride. Sometimes all we could do was sweep up the pieces. The clock ticked on while neither of us spoke. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the shutters. Inside, the room had settled back into its usual shape. Wolfe in his chair, me in mine. The unspoken tension folded into the books and the dark. I leaned forward, resting my arms on my knees. It wasn't the blood under the marble that got to me, I said. Wolfe looked up. It was thinking about all the ones we never see. All the quiet things people hide until someone gets pushed. He didn't answer right away. Just stared, expression unreadable. Then he gave the faintest nod, just once. That was all I'd get, and all I needed. Because Wolfe didn't offer sympathy, but agreement in his language was as rare as forgiveness. I rose, stretched, and moved toward the hall. Tell Fritz I'll eat in the kitchen, I said. And tomorrow, maybe give me a case that doesn't involve art, aristocracy, or stairs. Wolfe closed his eyes again. Don't be absurd, Archie. You'll take what comes. Fair enough. But this time, I'd keep my shoes off the marble. As Nero Wolfe once said, greed does not erupt, it seeps. And in this case, it seeped through every polished surface until the marble cracked, revealing not just a murder, but a legacy built on silence, betrayal, and stolen truths. Now here's something to ponder. Was Marion Croft's greatest mistake the theft itself? or believing Curtis Vale's sins somehow justified her own. We'd love to know what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy unraveling mysteries with Wolfe and Archie, be sure to subscribe for more classic cases and share this one with a fellow detective in your life.